getting back to the point here, so the Enlightenment confronts religion, and let's say that the Enlightenment wins. At least it wins that round. Okay, and then you have the shape of consciousness that Hegel calls pure insight, which means that we now have complete confidence in our ability to figure everything out based on the capacity of our consciousness to reason. And from this combination of pure insight and the principle of utility, we begin to develop a new principle of freedom. And that new principle of freedom becomes the driving force for what Jim is going to discuss now, and that's the French Revolution. And we'll get back to the discussion of Rousseau and Hegel on the French Revolution afterwards. We'll do some of it today and some of it next week. It's a pretty big topic. Okay, Jim, it's all yours.
Okay, I have the floor.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to confine myself, because this is such a very big topic, to outlining the main events of the revolution. I won't try to supply too much interpretation, because it would take not one session and not two, but 3, 4, 5, many. So I'm boiling this down as much as possible. And even then, it was a tall order, but to the main instances of the French Revolution, and that goes from that time frame is from 1789 to the end of the radical phase in 1794. Actually, you know that the French Revolution unleashed wars. For the wars of the French Revolution in Europe lasted for 20 years, but this is only the initial, the opening phase of the progressively radical phase of the French Revolution. Now, if you look at all of these revolutions of the century of revolutions, that is the English, the American, and French, you'll find that they have one thing in common, at least one thing, and that is their origins. All of these revolutions originated in the bankruptcy or financial straits of the crown, and their attempt to appeal to the population to raise money, to alleviate this bankruptcy or financial straits. In England, they called the Parliament, and in France, they called the Estates General. They didn't call any General Assembly in America, but you had the stamp taxes, the tea taxes, and so forth, which gave rise to a general discontent. So, when they try to levy these taxes, this gives rise to popular resistance, and this initiates a revolutionary process. Let's start on the French Revolution from the Estates General to the Bastille. The French crown was bankrupt, or nearing bankruptcy, for a number of reasons, and not least of which was the extravagant spending of the royal court, but more importantly, and to a much greater extent, the various wars that the country had engaged in, the 7 Years' War and others, which proved very costly. So King Louis, after many failed attempts at physical reform, King Louis summoned the Estates General in 1789, or the spring of 1789, to help him to help raise money for the crown. It had last met a very long time ago in 1614, but of course, by that time, things had radically changed. The French monarchy was considered by many in the French intelligentsia, the French Enlightenment, to be an outmoded institution, especially in light of the parliamentary regime of Britain. So the summoning of the Estates General was the occasion for a great deal of remonstrance and pamphleteering and political ferment. As you know, I think most people know, that the Estates General, as its name indicates, was divided into three estates, the first estate being the clergy, the second estate being the nobility, and the third estate being everybody else. And they voted not as a block, but by orders. That was the tradition. And now this tradition was severely under attack even before the estates met. One of the most famous pamphlets was that by the Abbé Sieyès, he was a priest, entitled, "What is the Third Estate?" And his answer was, "What is the third estate in actuality?" And his answer was basically all of the useful non-parasitic classes of the nation. What was it in law? Nothing. So this kind of sets the scene for the meeting of the third estate, of the Estates General, in which there are proposals that they end voting by estates and vote as a single body. Now this is accepted by some of the more enlightened nobility and even some of the priests. The third estate invites the other two estates to come and join them, and some do. But the third estate eventually rebels, and it declares itself the National Constituent Assembly of France. And upon this, King Louis XVI prorogues the assembly. He banishes it from Versailles, where it originally met, whereupon the assembly removes itself to a nearby tennis court and swears an oath not to disband until it has given France a constitution. And this is
tennis code or oath.
Yes, this is the famous oath of the tennis court, celebrated in a painting by Jacques-Louis David, the famous painter of the French Revolution. Yes. So at this point, Louis calls in mercenary troops and quarters them. They're mostly German and Prussian and some other nationalities, but they're not French. And they're quartered in the Champ de Mars, which, if any of you have ever been to Paris, is that stretch of greenery but between the Eiffel Tower and the École Militaire. And revolutionary Paris responds not by directly confronting the troops, but by storming the Bastille, which is a symbol of royal despotism, even though it only contains 7 prisoners at this point. But the governor of the prison refuses to surrender, and 1,000 people die in the resulting siege. The governor is ripped to pieces, and the Bastille is dismantled in the following weeks and months. So from this point, we go to the Declaration of the Republic. The National Assembly adopts the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, establishing the equality of all citizens under the law and abolishing noble titles. Now, Louis has enough, and the people around him has enough sense to realize that at this point, there is no purpose to be served by open resistance. So he retreats, and he vows to rule henceforth as a constitutional monarch. He even wears the revolution's tricolor cockades in his hat. And from this point on, we see the radicalization, the progressive radicalization of the revolution. And what drives it is a series of revelations, that the king's adherence to the constitution is no more than a pose, an expedient to gain time to execute his and Marie Antoinette's designs to restore the absolute power of the monarchy and of the nobles. So, the first of these revelations about Louis's true intentions consists at a banquet in Versailles, in which Marie Antoinette parades with the young Dauphin, that is the heir to the throne, in her arms, and the Swiss guards, who are the guards who are normally assigned to guard the king and queen, trample the tricolor cockades underfoot, or turn them inside out to display the white cockade of the monarch. Well, word of this banquet at Versailles soon reaches Paris and infuriates the masses who march. First of all, the women march on Versailles. This is about 7 miles from Paris, and they are protesting this banquet, and then tens of thousands more follow them. And the result is that they force Louis and Marie Antoinette to leave Versailles, come to Paris, and take up residence in the Tuileries Palace, where the Parisians can keep a closer eye on them. So both the storming of the Bastille and the marches on Versailles mark a new element in the unfolding of the revolution, and perhaps in history itself. And that is the direct intervention of the masses, variously called the Paris mob, the crowds, into history itself, into politics itself. They themselves, as opposed to their professional politicians and nobles, etc., become a major driving force of the French Revolution. They are known collectively as the sans-culottes, which means, in French today, that simply means underwear, but in those days, culottes were the knee breeches of fashionable society, and these were the ones without them. They just wore regular trousers. So, in 1790, there was widespread opposition to the revolution by the clergy, and one thing the National Assembly adopts is the civil constitution of the clergy, which requires priests to swear an oath of allegiance to the new republican government. And this divides the priesthood into the so-called juring, that is juring, J-U-R-I-G, and non-juring clergy, those who would take the oath and those who don't. Okay, so now we have Louis and Marie Antoinette in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, And in 1791, this is the second indication of their intentions. They attempt to flee Paris in disguise to join Louis's brother. The Comte d'Artois, who has fled the country, is in Austria, and he was already beginning to assemble a counter-revolutionary force there. So Louis is recognized. His profile is he's disguised as a woman, tries to flee in the small hours of the morning, disguised as a woman. And how is he recognized? His profile, which is very distinctive, is recognized through the window of the carriage he's riding in by a postmaster who is comparing the profile he sees in the carriage window and with the profile he sees in the coin. The cortege is apprehended, and Louis is in the town of Varennes, and Louis is returned to Paris. Now, at this point, Austria and Prussia form a military alliance with the avowed aim of invading France and restoring the monarchy. In this, they have the support of the Pope and most other crowned heads of Europe. And as the royalist foreign army, known as the Army of Koblenz after the Austrian town, which are its headquarters, this marches on Paris, and as it advances toward the capital, the National Assembly declares the patrie en danger, that is the country in danger, and orders a mass mobilization of French citizens drawn from all over the country to defend the capital. The mayor of Strasbourg, which is in the north of France, it's in Alsace, as you know, at this point, went to a well-known local composer named Roger de Lille and asked him to write a revolutionary anthem. And the song he composes is titled The Marching Song of the Lower Rhine. It becomes particularly popular, however, with a group of volunteers marching to defend Paris from the opposite southern end of France, from Marseille. And they are the ones who give the anthem, the name it has today, the Marseillaise. So, the king is at this point using his constitutional power of the veto. This is in the constitutional monarchy constitution that they have adopted, to block every major legislative measure by the government. He acquires the name Monsieur Veto. And at the bequest of Louis and especially of Marie Antoinette, the Duke of Brunswick, who is heading the counter-revolutionary armies who are starting to march on Paris, issues something called the Brunswick Manifesto, threatening massive and lethal retaliation against the people of Paris should any harm come to the royal couple. This infuriates the Parisians. So now, I don't know. Maybe we need short break. Any questions up to now, or should I just go
on? I think it's great so far. I think you should go on.
Okay.
If anybody has any questions, go ahead.
Okay. Anybody? By the way, since this does go on for a while, feel free to interrupt with any questions, any comments you want to make. So the revolution now takes a decidedly radical turn. Danton, Georges Danton, one of the leaders of the revolution, seizes the Hotel de Ville, which is the city hall of Paris, in the name of the Revolutionary Commune of Paris, supported by the representative local bodies known as the sections. And these are basically the lower orders of Paris, the sans-culottes, which are now in continuous assembly. And as one indication of the radical turn that events has taken, the appellations Monsieur and Madame are abolished, and everyone is henceforth to be addressed by the title citizen. And a revolutionary tribunal for enemies of the revolution is established for the first time. As a result of this takeover by the Commune of Paris, this gives the masses the green light to storm the Tuileries Palace. And after a battle with the Swiss guards who were defending it, the king and queen are driven out. They take refuge in the assembly, and then they are made prisoners in the Temple prison. Now, all this time, remember, the army of Koblenz, the Contras of their day, are advancing on Paris. And as Verdun falls to them, the fear grips Paris, the masses, that the imprisoned royalists and counter-revolutionaries could act as a fifth column if the army conquers the capital, fingering revolutionaries for the invaders to inflict revenge for the king's fate as threatened in the Brunswick Manifesto. So mobs spontaneously descend upon several prisons, passing summary judgments upon and killing many of those suspected of royalist sympathies on the spot. These impromptu tribunals are set up outside of the prisons, and those who can convince the tribunals that they're not counter-revolutionaries are let go, but those who can't are summarily killed. And since in those days it was customary for families to join the imprisoned member, children were also killed. Between 1500 and 2000 were put to death. Religion isn't always a bright and optimistic business. It has an ugly and sanguinary side, necessarily.
You said religion. I think you meant revolution, right?
Excuse me, religion too, though. Yes, even more so. But yes, sorry. Revolution has this ugly side. So now, but the army of Koblenz has no easy walk to Paris. Despite the fact that it is comprised of professional mercenaries, the ragtag army confronts it at a hill outside Paris called Valmy, and there the Contras of their day are turned back. The German poet Goethe has accompanied this army, the army of Koblenz, and after the defeat in the officers' mess, when they're dying, he said to them, this battle marks the birth of a new age, and each of you could say that you were present at its birth. So now, the National Assembly, the legislative body that was based upon the constitutional monarchy, obviously can no longer exist since the monarchy has fallen. And it is dissolved and replaced by the National Convention, which declares an end to the monarchy and the First French Republic. Louis XVI is put on trial before the convention for treasonous conspiracy with the revolution's enemies. The vote for his execution is 360 against to 361.4. It is obviously a very contentious issue, but the execution goes ahead, and Louis is publicly beheaded in what was then the Place de la Révolution. For people who have been to Paris, it is now the Place de la Concorde, where the obelisk of Luxor is at the Madeleine, and this execution took place on January 21st, 1793. Now, I'll attempt to summarize the complicated further unfolding of the revolution. The revolutionary camp at this point begins to divide into the more radical elements, supported by the sans-culottes of Paris, who want to push the revolution as far as possible in the direction of complete social and economic equality. And those, on the other hand, who think the revolution has gone far enough and wish to slam on the brakes. The more moderate deputies and leaders became known as the Gironde, named after the French department from which many of them came. They were seated on the right side of the convention as one faced its semicircular amphitheater from the podium. The more radical deputies were seated on, and the conservative deputies were seated on the right side, and the more radical deputies were seated on the left side, giving rise to a political terminology that persists to this day. The convention was under continuous pressure from the Paris streets, as members of the radical commune frequently invaded the convention floor, demanding and ultimately obtaining the expulsion of 136 right-wing deputies and the adoption of social measures. The most militant faction of the Paris masses were known as the Enragés, and they were led, among others, by a former priest called Jacques. And the dominant force in the convention, though, were the Jacobins. The leading names we associate with this phase of the revolution, Georges Danton, Jean-Paul Marat, Louis de Saint-Just, all belonged to the Jacobin Club, so named because it met in the former residence of a priestly order of that name. There were different currents of opinion among the Jacobins, but despite their radical reputation, we shouldn't forget that, like the Girondins, they were mostly provincial magistrates and lawyers, with a social outlook that can be broadly described as bourgeois. They did not support the demands of the extreme left for social equality, and in fact denounced the Enragés. Yet the Jacobins knew that the revolution faced formidable obstacles, which could not be overcome without wide popular support. By this time, Britain and Holland had joined what had become known as the First Coalition against the French Revolution, and France declared war on these countries. To add to their torments, sections of provincial France, most notably in the central West Vendée region and the city of Lyon, had risen in rebellion against the new government. Charlotte Corday famously came from Normandy and assassinated Marat in his bathtub in July of 1793. So representing as they did the more determined of the leading revolutionary factions, the Jacobins understood they could not prevail without making serious concessions to the Paris masses. Although it went against their inclinations to interfere with the workings of the market, they nevertheless passed, most significantly, the law of the maximum, regulating the price of foodstuffs, especially of bread, which was the staple of the popular diet. the Jacobin Convention also adopted measures intended to emphasize their revolutionary nature, including the introduction of the metric system and the adoption of a new republican calendar. So now we come to the events that are commonly known as the Terror. In 1793, the convention elected a 12-member executive body, one of the executive bodies they elected, and this was tasked with the maintenance of order and the defense of the revolution, and it was called the Committee of Public Safety. The convention also passes the law of suspects, making it much easier to arrest and convict those suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. The head of the committee soon perhaps becomes the most famous figure of the revolution, venerated by the French left and reviled by the right, Maximilien Robespierre. The period over which the committee and Robespierre presided, from approximately September 1793 to August 1794, has become known to history as the Reign of Terror. During this time, arrest warrants were issued freely, and proceedings of the Revolutionary Tribunal took on a much more summary character. Approximately 1,000 Parisians were guillotined during this period, but many more died at government hands during the repression of counter-revolutionary risings in the provinces. I said I wouldn't do too much interpreting here, but perhaps we can pause for a moment to consider the significance of this most emotionally and politically charged episode of the French Revolution. First, I think we can say that the Terror regime, despite the observance of judicial forms, was not overly concerned with individual guilt or innocence. Its purpose was contained in its name: to create an atmosphere of dread and demoralization among the aristocracy, refractory priests, and other enemies of the revolution. It was animated by a conviction that only such ruthless determination could save a regime beleaguered on multiple fronts. Second, I think it can be said that the Terror had the arguably harmful effect of substituting itself for the initiatives of the Paris masses. Because the regime was striking at their enemies, it seemed no longer necessary for the sans-culottes to do so directly. As a result, as we shall see, this had certain fatal consequences for the revolution. Thirdly, what of the ideas of those who carried out the Terror, especially the one, Robespierre, who attempted to explain himself most fully? For Robespierre, terror was the defender of last resort of what he and the revolution as a whole considered its supreme purpose: the inauguration of the reign of virtue in public life. In a rhetorical turn, redeployed by Kant, by the way, and others, Robespierre famously said, "Terror without virtue is murderous, a virtue without terror is impotence." So Alex asked me to say something about the concept of virtue in the revolution. So what exactly did Robespierre mean by it? Reading through his speeches, and I've been doing a little bit of this, his discourse on virtue can't but seem to us, I think, highly moralistic. By virtue, he means above all civic virtue, which he believes to comprise the natural instincts of the common people. They wish to live modestly on terms of peace and equality with one another. They are instinctively mindful of the welfare of others, of the common weal. The enemies of virtue, on the other hand, are ruled by selfish passions, by the desire for unlimited wealth and self-aggrandizement at the expense of the majority of ordinary, virtuous folk. And here there are echoes of Rousseau's distinction between the general and the individual will. Robespierre, along with most other revolutionaries, was very influenced by Rousseau and the social contract. Robespierre repeatedly speaks of the people as representing oppressed innocence at the hands of the evil people who have ruled the world for most of history. They're personified by kings and aristocrats, and have until the dawn of reason, represented by the French Revolution, been the dominant force despite their small numbers. However, in the events that followed, it became clear that Robespierre tended more and more to consider himself the personification of virtue and reason. In 1794, he lashes out against both the right and left of his own Jacobin faction. On the right were the so-called indulgents, most prominently Danton and Camille Desmoulins, who were calling for a scaling back of the terror. On the left, there were the followers of a man called Hegel, who were mounting a de-Christianizing campaign, attempting to substitute reason itself for religion. Over the cemeteries, they hung signs proclaiming, "Death is an eternal sleep." And if you look closely at some of the bas-reliefs depicting the lives of the saints on the outer walls of Notre Dame Cathedral, you could see where the heads of some saints were chiseled off by the de-Christianizers. You can still see that today. Now, Robespierre was appalled by this campaign. He thought that atheism was detrimental to the morals of the common people, who required the assurance of immortality and the God who rewards good and punishes evil. Robespierre thus dispatched both the rightist indulgents, Danton and Desmoulins, and the de-Christianizer Hébert to the guillotine at about the same time. Robespierre then celebrated his triumph over adversaries by organizing a festival of the Supreme Being in the Champ de Mars. It was an attempt to establish a new deist state religion that included the immortality of the soul and eternal reward for the practice of virtue. Robespierre himself planned the event and presided, dressed in white robes resembling those of Greece and Rome, whose civilizations he thought embodied the rule of virtue. The festival marked the height of Robespierre's personal power. But it was not to last. By the summer of 1794, France was enjoying growing success against its foreign enemies on the battlefields and had succeeded in suppressing domestic revolts. Since the sense of crisis was dissipating to a great degree, there arose a natural desire for the terror to relent. But Robespierre would have none of it. The terror remained in full force, and Robespierre gave a speech before the convention, claiming that there were still counter-revolutionaries lurking in the country and in the convention itself. But the deputies demanded that Robespierre name whom he was referring to, so that if they wished they could give these people up and save themselves. He refused. This led the deputies to fear that any one of them could be Robespierre's next victim. They thus hatched a secret plot against him and the Committee of Public Safety. And on the 9th Thermidor, this is by the new calendar, prevented Robespierre from speaking at the convention and placed him and other committee members under arrest. They sentenced Robespierre and two others, Coutan and Saint-Just, to the guillotine. An attempt was made to appeal to the Paris sections to rescue Robespierre, but remember, he had weakened them by the previous purge of the left. And so the attempt was unsuccessful. He had succeeded in cutting off his left arm. So Robespierre and his cohorts were guillotined the same day. The purge of Robespierre was not intended by the plotters as an act with any definite political aim. They were interested in nothing more than saving their own skins. But the fall of the Committee of Public Safety publicly signaled an end to the terror, and all the right-wing, aristocratic, and pro-royalist forces took it as a signal to come out of the woodwork and raise their heads. Jacobins were attacked in the streets by an emboldened jeunesse dorée, that is the golden youth of the aristocracy, who had been keeping their heads down for fear of the terror. Those awaiting execution were released, and the aristocrats held lavish balls that included mock reenactments of the rituals surrounding the guillotine. Laws regulating the price of bread and other foodstuffs were revoked, and this did give rise to a revolt of the Paris sans-culottes to restore the previous regime. But unlike in the Great Fear of 1798, where the peasants took advantage of the Paris revolt to seize the land from the nobility, by this time they had already secured their land holdings and thus did not support the urban insurrection, which therefore failed. Thus, although the carnival of reaction did not succeed in restoring the monarchy or nobility, the 9th Thermidor marked the definitive end to the radical phase of the French Revolution, which brings us to the end of our saga.